the tendency, when thinking about the 20th century disaster of actually existing communism, is to try to locate the moment of aberration, the turn where history went wrong. What if we take Slavoj Žižek's Hegelian reading seriously and dare to admit that the potential for Stalinism is present even in Marx? Of course, this does not make Marx responsible for the deaths in Soviet Russia at the hands of a system that he would hardly recognize as communist. It simply means that we should always proceed with caution in assuming some sort of moment of purity of origins. An obsession with origins have plagued historical critical studies of the Bible as well. One of the massive challenges to conventional approaches to searching for origins is in the work of Robyn Faith Walsh. Her thesis that the German Protestant critics of the Bible had cultural assumptions that obfuscated how they read the early Christian texts and how they constructed the foundation of the development of the science of historical critical studies is an audacious claim. And this is the assumption in historical criticism, that there are underlying community roots behind the text of the Gospels and the Bible, rely on models based on thinking that fits with Protestant, anti-Semitic, and anti-Catholic biases. If the Gospels are, as Walsh claims convincingly, products of a cultural elite and are not based on the religious practices of the earliest communities of believers, as is usually assumed, then the quest for the origins of the sense of recovery of the original text of the Gospels becomes even more of a process that's obscured, as the earliest texts of the Gospels would still be products of non-eyewitnesses with very little knowledge of the historical Jesus or his actual message. If these members of the cultural elite were competing with each other to construct the definitive narrative of their literary subject, in this case Jesus, then the historicity of the Gospels becomes an extremely problematic in any sense. Again, the point is that the origins are not always pure, or at least the search for origins is not necessarily pure. One line of distinction between the Asbury revival and a genuine populist movement involves a closer analysis of the actors. The revival can be formally democratic and populist, as the Asbury event obviously is. It is seemingly spontaneous and student-initiated. It seems to be organically organized and planned and self-organized around worship, and organization is taking place at the grassroots level. But these are not neutral actors. All of this movement is deeply contextualized in evangelical Christianity. It does not have an explosive populist potential, even at its most radical, because of these very parameters. Even the most liberatory aspects of the revival are not being managed from without, but from within. There have been brigades that have managed homophobia and other controversial outside forces, but also the spokespeople from the revival have a very carefully cultivated message, the message of Christian tolerance. This is a cultural buzzword that falls far short of a radical call to love your neighbor, to hate your family, that come from the Christ of the Gospels, the one who brings the sword and comes not to bring peace, but to turn families against each other. It would be easy to imagine a revival in the early church, described by the author of Acts, spontaneously bursting into collective ownership. This is an impossibility at Asbury. This is not because of a revisionist counterforce, but because the fundamental ideological universe in which the Asbury revival exists cannot even perceive it as a possibility. The very parameters of possibility are ideologically constrained. As Karl Marx observed, atheism is far less controversial than a critique of the political economy. And I think I was going to develop that point more and just didn't really. But is this not true for every other populist movement as well? Is there a difference between the constraints of imagination dictated through mediation of the ideological assumptions of evangelical Christianity and the limits of possibility imposed on every inhabitant of the planet through our mediation by global capitalism? It is crucial to identify these limits in the secular ideological economy that function in the same way as religious dogma. A couple other points that I didn't develop but was thinking about. The university at Asbury was embroiled in a scandal involving gender and sexual identity discrimination. If you were cynical, you could make the case that the revival is either to distract from that scandal or to disarm criticism around that scandal by affirming a brand of Christianity that's more tolerant for mass media around the university. It's far from clear that there's any consensus of what this revival is really all about. The revival and movements in the past, even up to and including the Great Awakening, are reflections of the dominant ideology of their times, or the times in which they exist. So, for example, when Jonathan Edwards preached a Calvinism that relied on rhetorical flourishes about eternal damnation, the result was thought inducing fits of failing. In the Asbury's case, it exists in our modern age of capitalist realism, where the inner exploration of the true self is the task of ideology par excellence. It is therefore not surprising that the revival takes the form of reflective worship. Its focus on feelings and emotions and feeling God's presence internally, and it focuses on experiencing manifestations of God's love.